Okay, hello students, this is Professor Vincent Osagai. Welcome to my class. This is part 2 of chapter 4 presentation. Chapter 4 risk assessment. Now, we did the overview in part 1 of this chapter, but I forgot to mention something that is very important in terms of what we are trying to accomplish in this chapter. Here we are going to talk about the audit risk in this chapter, but more importantly, it is risk assessment, meaning we are evaluating the risk in connection with the audit engagement. Why are we doing that? In order for us to determine exactly how to go about managing the risk. Just like one of my favorite examples is I ask my students why they normally will go about asking other students questions about other professors, because they want to know what they're up against and they want to know whether to take a particular professor or not. Now, of course, if they don't have a choice and they realize that they are going to face a professor that is extremely stringent, then they go ahead and they prepare and manage that risk accordingly. So bottom line is, in this chapter, we are evaluating and assessing risk in order to determine how to manage it as an auditor. Now, having said that, let's take a look at using the audit risk model. We have talked about this relatively extensively in part 1. Here in part 2, we are going to demonstrate how the audit risk model is used to determine the appropriate level of detection risk. So let's take a look at what we have here. At this point in time, I want you to take some notes. Okay, here are some important truths that you need to understand before you are able to comprehend the mathematical illustration of the audit risk model. Number one, we indicated earlier that the auditor does not have control over the inherent risk and control risk. Why? Because these risks are functions of the client's environment. Now, number two, we said that the auditor has control over detection risk. How? Because he's able to do something about it by way of being more vigilant and by way of doing more testing. Now, another truth that you need to understand, we said that if inherent risk and control risk are assessed or evaluated to be high, then detection risk has to be set at low, or vice versa. Okay? In other words, inherent risk and control risk have inverse relationship with detection risk. And we said that this inverse relationship exists in order for the auditor to obtain the planned level of audit risk. Now, what does this all mean? Let us go ahead and demonstrate it mathematically, then it will make a little bit more sense to you. Now, we said that the audit risk consists of okay, now let's assume that the auditor set accounts the audit risk of salary as 10%. So the auditor set the audit risk of salary expense at 10%. And inherent risk is set to be 70%. And control risk 50%. So let's go ahead and work this out mathematically and see what we have. So if the audit risk is 10%, that is 0.1. The inherent risk is 70%, equals to 0.7, multiplied by control risk of 0.5. And then detection risk is unknown, All right, so we have A arrow, we have I arrow, we have C arrow, and detection risk is unknown. So mathematically, if you solve for X, X will give you 29%. So the detection risk is 29%. So let me recap. We set audit risk of salaries and wages to be 10%, I arrow 70, C arrow 50. You work out the formula and you find out that detection risk is 29%. Now, let's change one element of these variables. Let's assume that we increase the control risk. Further assessment makes us to believe that the control risk really should be more than 50%, that the controls are not properly well thought of, the controls are not properly put in place, they are not properly implemented. We change our mind and say, whoa, we need to increase control risk to 90%. So if control risk is increased to 90% and everything remains the same, let's go ahead and solve for detection risk. Now we have 0.1, 0, multiplied by inherent risk is 0.7, multiplied by, instead of 0.5 or 50%, we now have 90%. Now, of course, detection risk is unknown. So if you solve for X now, X is now 16% versus 29%. So detection risk went down from 29 to 16. Why? Because one of these two variables, control risk went up, detection risk went down. So what is the implication of that? The implication of that is detection, the lower detection risk is, the more evidence we have to gather, the more work we have to do. Because when we reduce detection risk, meaning we are not willing to take as much detection risk as originally planned, in order for us to obtain the appropriate level of the audit risk that we originally established. So that is basically how we use audit risk model to appropriately determine the scope of our work, how much work we need to do. So moving along, let's take a look at the relationship of the entity's business risk to the appropriate risk model. Now, what does that mean? So let's take a look at this diagram. We said that we assess the entity business risk. We relate those risks to what can go wrong at the account balance or disclosure level. We assess the risk of material misstatement. Then we wind up using the audit model to solve for the level of detection risk. So let's go back here. Assess the entity business risk. What does that mean? Here we are trying to understand the client, the environment in which the clients operate in. We are trying to understand the potential risk that the client normally will face during the process or during the course of doing their work. We want to know how the clients address those issues. We also want to know different performance measures that the client uses. Now let me give you an example. Then by the time we do that, take a look at the next slide. We now relate those risks to what can possibly go wrong at the account balance or disclosure level. Here's a very good example for you. Let's assume that when we assess the entity business risk, which consists of understanding the entity, the environment in which they operate in, how they go about doing their activities, their performance measures that they have in place, so on and so forth, then we are able to determine what can possibly go wrong in an account balance level. So let's assume that this company has different branches across the nation, all right? And each manager is compensated based on sales volume. In other words, manager gets big bonus depending on how much sales they generate. Now, if that is how they compensate their manager, as an auditor, why should you be concerned about that? You should be concerned about that because in that kind of environment, it is likely that some managers might play with their sales numbers in order for them to get a huge bonus at the end of the year. So from that standpoint, as an auditor, you are concerned about the possibility of the sales revenue being materially misstated. Now, compare that to another company that have locations across the nation. However, they pay their manager based on salary. No commission, no incentive package as that. So whether you perform well or not, whether your sales goes up or not, it doesn't matter. Everybody is on a fixed salary. In such circumstance, as an auditor, you don't have to worry about the possibility of the sales revenue being misstated or somebody playing games with the sales number. So let's take it again. So look at, so we assess the entity business risk. We relate those risks to what can go wrong at the account balance or disclosure level. Then we assess the risk of material misstatement. How do we assess the risk of material misstatement? We take a look at the inherent risk. We take a look at the control risk. Then we solve for detection risk in order to determine the scope of our work. Now, moving along, let's take a look at using the audit risk model. Now, the first thing we just demonstrated, mathematically how the audit risk model is used. We can also use the audit risk model in a non-quantitative manner. In other words, we can also use the same model without going through a lot of calculations. Here's an example. Look at this. This is qualitative terms. In qualitative terms instead of quantitative terms. Look at case 1 here. Case 1. We said that if the audit risk in one particular area that we are auditing is low or very low, meaning we really don't anticipate too much problem in this area, then the inherent risk and control risk are considered to be high, then the detection risk is considered to be low. So let me take that again, case 1. Audit risk is very low and the risk of material misstatement high, detection risk is said to be low. Let's take a look at case 2. Here we said that the audit risk is low, then let's take a look at 3. Audit risk is low, the risk of material misstatement, that is inherent risk and control risk, are said to be low, then the detection risk is said to be high. So if detection risk is said to be high, we are willing to take more risk in this area because the likelihood of something going wrong or an account being materially misstated is not that great. So we are going to gather as less evidence as possible. Unlike number 1, where the detection rate is pretty low, because we are willing to, because we assess the audit risk to be very low. Therefore, we are going to go ahead and gather more evidence in that situation. Now, moving along, we said that the audit risk model has some limitations, all right? So we just use it as a planning tool, all right, to determine the nature, timing, and extent of our audit. As time progresses, it is not unusual for us to revise the plan during the course of audit. Now, the limitations are as follows. The desired level of audit risk may not actually be achieved. We really don't know for sure, and it does not consider potential auditor error. In other words, the model does not, there's no way of the model can consider a potential error on the side of the auditor. and there's no way of knowing what the preliminary level of risk of material misstatement actually was. Okay, so it's a guess issue. Our preliminary assessment level of risk and the actual or achieved level of risk could be plus or minus. Moving along, I think this will be the end of part 2 presentation of chapter 4.